This is my mother from the countryside who came to visit me, but my wife led the dog to chase Lay.
The large screen in the living room suddenly lit up, and the entire mansion of billionaire Adewale instantly fell into silence. On the screen appeared footage from the front gate camera, a scene that made many people in the room hold their breath. An elderly woman wearing simple, worn rural clothes stood nervously outside the luxurious gate, holding an old cloth bag in her hands. She looked small and out of place in front of the grand mansion. She was Adewale's mother, who had just traveled from a poor village to visit her son after many years apart. But what shocked everyone even more was what happened next. The moment the gate opened, a large dog was suddenly released, barking aggressively as it charged toward the elderly woman. Startled and terrified, she stumbled backward and fell onto the stone pathway, and the person who released the dog was Adewale's wife. Inside the luxurious living room filled with guests, not a single person spoke. The music from the party had already stopped. Only the glow from the screen illuminated the stunned faces of the guests. Adewale stood in the middle of the room, his eyes cold as he watched the video he himself had prepared for that evening. What everyone believed to be a simple family gathering was actually the moment the truth was about to be revealed. This story is not just about a wealthy family. It is a powerful reminder about gratitude and how we treat the people who sacrificed everything for us. In life, we may gain wealth, fame, and beautiful mansions. But if we forget the mother who gave birth to us and raised us, do those things truly mean anything? If you're listening to this story, let me know where you're watching from around the world. I always love seeing how these stories reach the hearts of viewers in different places. And if you enjoy emotional stories and meaningful life lessons like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Stay with us until the end, because what happened after the camera footage ended left the entire Adewale family in complete shock. A few days before that party, Adewale returned home earlier than scheduled without telling anyone in the house. The 2-week business trip had drained his strength, but what exhausted him even more wasn't the endless meetings or the back-to-back flights. It was the strange uneasiness that had followed him for days. Something in his brief phone calls with Esther had left a cold feeling in his chest. She still sounded sweet and gentle as always, but she spoke too quickly when mentioning things at home, too neatly when answering questions about his mother in the village, as if she had already prepared every word, so he wouldn't ask any deeper questions. The black car slowly turned onto the road leading to the mansion as the sun dipped low, casting a pale golden glow over the iron gate. Adewale was about to tell the driver to go straight in when his eyes suddenly froze. In front of the gate, where there should have been only security guards and the occasional gardener, stood a thin, fragile figure huddled near the roadside. The elderly woman wore faded village clothes. Dust clung to her old sandals. One hand clutched a worn cloth bag tightly to her chest, while the other trembled as it held onto the iron bar of the gate, as if she needed it to keep herself from falling. Adewale's heart tightened the moment he realized who it was. His mother. She could no longer stand straight. Her back was more bent than the last time he visited the village. Her thin gray hair fluttered across her forehead in the wind. Her sun-darkened face, wrinkled from years of hardship, carried a tiredness so deep it was painful to see. But what made Adewale freeze wasn't just the sight of his mother standing outside his mansion with no one welcoming her. It was what stood right in front of her. 2 large dogs were lunging forward, barking wildly. The chains around their necks were stretched so tight it seemed that if someone let go, they would immediately attack her. Beside them, the security guard stood straight but made no effort to stop anything. And a few steps away, wearing an elegant dress, shining high heels, and a face completely devoid of emotion, Esther stood with her arms crossed. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the quiet evening air. Let the dogs out. She shouldn't be here. Inside the car, Adewale felt as if every sound around him had been sucked away. He could no longer hear the engine. He could no longer hear the rustling leaves. All he could hear was the pounding of blood in his temples, and the furious barking that seemed to tear his heart apart. Part of him wanted to open the door immediately, rush out, hold his mother, and shout at everyone standing there. But another part, the calm, calculating, suspicious part of a man who had survived too long in the ruthless world of business, kept him still. Adewale gestured quietly for the driver to turn off the engine. "Don't get out," he said softly, his eyes still fixed on the gate. "Back up a little." The car slowly reversed into the shadow behind a row of large trees along the road. Through the dark-tinted window, Adewale continued watching. He saw his mother's lips moving as she tried to explain something. Perhaps she was saying she was the owner's mother. Perhaps she was explaining that she had traveled all the way from the village just to see her son. Perhaps she was apologizing for disturbing anyone. But Esther didn't step closer. She didn't open the gate. She didn't even show the smallest hint of respect. Her face only showed cold irritation, as if the frail old woman outside the gate was not her mother-in-law, but merely a beggar who had wandered to the wrong house. Then one of the dogs was loosened from its chain. It lunged forward, barking even louder. His mother stumbled backward in fear. The cloth bag slipped from her hands. A few humble village gifts spilled onto the ground, a small bundle of cola nuts, a few tiny oranges, and a carefully wrapped piece of cloth, perhaps something she had brought for her son. The sight struck Adewale like a knife through his memory. He remembered his childhood in the small village. He remembered his mother walking under the burning sun to the market, saving every coin so he could go to school. He remembered her thin hands cooking him one last meal before he left for the city. And he remembered her voice saying, "Go, my son. I will live anywhere, as long as you become someone." And now, the woman who had sacrificed her entire life for him was standing outside the gate of her own son's house, threatened by angry dogs, under the cold eyes of the woman who carried the title of his wife. Adewale clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Anger surged through him like waves of fire. But he still didn't get out of the car. Not because he was weak, but because in that moment he understood something important. This wasn't just a sudden outburst. This was the truth. And if Esther dared to do this openly at the front gate, then there was a strong chance it wasn't the first time. Finally, after several tense minutes, his mother slowly bent down and gathered the fallen items with trembling hands. She didn't cry out loud. And somehow that hurt Adewale even more. The deepest humiliation often comes not with tears, but with the silence of someone who has endured hardship their entire life. She hugged the worn cloth bag back to her chest, turned away, and walked slowly down the road, each step heavy, as if she were stepping on the heart of the son who sat frozen inside the car. Adewale closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. "Go through the side gate," he told the driver in a low, firm voice. "And don't tell anyone I came home." That night, the mansion was brightly lit as if nothing had happened. Esther greeted him with her usual gentle smile. She asked how his trip had been and even had dinner brought to his study. She acted so perfectly that if Adewale hadn't to witness the scene at the gate earlier that evening, he might have believed everything in the house was still peaceful. But true peace never carries the cold eyes of someone watching an elderly mother being chased away from the gate. When the entire house had fallen asleep, Adewale walked alone into his private office. He didn't turn on the main lights. Only the glow from his laptop screen illuminated his tense face. His fingers moved to the mansion's security camera system. He selected the front gate camera, then he rewound the footage. The screen lit up. His mother appeared again, smaller, lonelier, more fragile under the cold angle of the camera. He saw that she had been standing there for a long time before Esther came out. He saw the weak smile on her face when she recognized her daughter-in-law, as if she still believed she would be invited inside. He saw her lips calling her son's name. He saw Esther glance at her worn clothes with undisguised contempt, and then he heard it again. Clearer and more cruel than before, words that earlier his anger had allowed him to feel, but not fully hear. "Let the dogs out. She shouldn't be here." If Mr. Aidwale sees her like this, it will embarrass this family. Aidwale froze. This wasn't just rejection. This wasn't just cruelty. It was deliberate humiliation. He rewound the video again. And again, each time he watched it, his chest felt tighter. Until the moment appeared once more, his mother bending down to pick up the fallen items at her feet. Aidwale could no longer sit still. He stood up abruptly, both hands pressing against the desk, his head lowered, his breathing heavy as if trying to contain the storm rising inside his chest. That night, in the quietest room of the mansion, a son's heart shattered. And with it, the trust Aidwale once had in the woman he believed would stand beside him to protect his family began to collapse. Aidwale sat motionless in front of the screen. The entire room was lit only by the cold blue glow reflecting across his tense face. Outside the wide glass windows, the mansion garden was completely silent, the tall palm trees standing still in the night like mute witnesses. But inside that room, every second passed with a crushing weight, as if stones were pressing against his chest. On the screen, the footage from the gate camera continued to play, and each frame that appeared felt like a thin blade cutting deeper into the heart of a man who once believed he was strong enough to face anything in the world. At first, Aidwale still tried to cling to a fragile hope that perhaps he had misunderstood. Maybe it had only been a moment of anger. Maybe Esther had simply acted without thinking. Maybe the cruelty he saw that afternoon had been the first and only time. But then he began rewinding the footage from previous days. The security system stored recordings from several weeks. He opened each time marker, each day, each afternoon, each morning. And then the truth appeared cold, clear, and more brutal than anything he could have imagined. This was not the first time. His mother had come to the mansion many times before. Some days she stood outside the gate early in the morning, a faded shawl draped over her shoulders, dust still clinging to her feet from the long road, holding a small cloth bag carefully in her arms like someone afraid of disturbing anyone. Some days she brought simple gifts from the village, a few oranges, some roasted peanuts, small humble offerings from the poor village she believed her son still remembered. Once she even sat down on the stone step outside the gate, perhaps because she had walked too far and was too tired. Her small shoulders curled under the harsh sun, yet she waited patiently, as if seeing her son just once would make every hardship worthwhile. And in almost every one of those moments, Esther appeared, not as a daughter-in-law welcoming her husband's mother, not with even the smallest gesture of respect for an elderly woman who had traveled so far to see her son. She stepped out with a cold expression, her eyes sharp like knives. Sometimes she stood inside the yard simply watching, as if observing something unpleasant. Then she signaled to the security guard. Then she ordered the chains released, and the dogs would rush forward barking loudly, baring their teeth, forcing the fragile old woman to retreat from the gate like a stranger who had no right to exist there. In one clip, his mother tried to say something. The camera didn't capture every word clearly, but Aidwale watched her lips and knew. She was calling his name. She was saying she was Aidwale's mother. She was begging to see her son just for a moment. Esther did not respond with compassion. She crossed her arms, turned slightly toward the guard, and her voice came through the camera, audio quiet, yet clear enough for Aidwale to hear every word. Don't let her in. If she comes again, release the dogs sooner. Aidwale felt his entire body go cold. He had never been afraid during billion-dollar negotiations. He had never hesitated when facing opponents far more powerful than himself. But that night, sitting alone in front of the screen, he realized he was witnessing something far more terrifying than poverty or failure. The true face of the woman who slept beside him, ate at the same table, and smiled at him every day as if she were the safest part of his life. He kept watching. In another clip, his mother no longer tried to explain anything. She simply stood there, both trembling hands gripping the worn strap of her cloth bag. The wind pressed her old dress against her thin, fragile body. One of the dogs lunged forward, making her step back in fear. But she didn't scream. She didn't complain. She didn't curse anyone. She didn't beg again. She only stood there, her cloudy eyes aged by time, looking through the black iron gate into the grand mansion her son had built through a lifetime of struggle. It was a long look, a very long look, as if she still carried a small hope that the gate would open, that her son would appear, that all of this was simply a misunderstanding. But no one appeared. No one invited her inside. No one told Esther to stop. Finally, she bent down to pick up the scarf that had slipped from her shoulder, slowly turned around, and walked away. No crying, no complaints. Just the slowly bending figure of an old woman disappearing from the corner of the camera, so small that Adwale had to grip the edge of the desk to keep himself from jumping up. It was that silence that crushed him. If she had cried, perhaps he could have endured it a little better. If she had blamed someone, maybe he could have found a way to forgive himself for not being there. But his mother did nothing. She endured the humiliation quietly, as if she had spent a lifetime swallowing her tears, as if the most painful thing to her was not being chased away by dogs, but the fear of causing trouble for her son. And that realization made guilt rise inside Adwale like a flood breaking through a dam. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the screen. The room sank into deep darkness. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each sound dry and hollow. Meanwhile, childhood memories suddenly flooded his mind with painful clarity. He saw again the small mud house in the Nigerian village where his mother woke before dawn to cook porridge for him before school. He saw her worn sandals stepping through muddy roads each rainy season to sell crops at the market. He remembered those thin hands touching his head and saying that no matter how far he went in life, he should never forget where he began. His mother couldn't read much. She didn't understand contracts, shares, or luxurious buildings. But it was that hard-working woman who had laid the first brick of his life with sweat, hunger, and a youth slowly stolen by time. And what had he given her? A house in the village with caretakers? Money sent regularly each month? Short phone calls during holidays? He had once believed he had fulfilled his duty as a successful son. But tonight, in front of this cold screen, he realized that none of those things could replace the simplest truth. His mother had come looking for him, and he was not there to protect her. Adwale sat like that for hours. The screen brightened and darkened as the footage replayed again and again. Outside, the night deepened. Then near dawn, when the edge of the sky began to pale in the distance, he slowly stood up. His body felt stiff from sitting so long. But his eyes had changed. There was no longer shock, no longer chaotic pain. That pain had settled into something colder, steadier, more dangerous. He walked toward the glass window and looked out at the garden where tomorrow everything would still appear perfect. The servants would clean the pathways. The chandeliers would shine. Esther would probably wake up, put on makeup, smile, and ask if he wanted breakfast on the terrace, as if nothing had ever happened. But Adwale knew that from this moment on, nothing inside that house would ever be the same. Trust had died in the night. And when trust dies, the truth must be dragged into the light. He returned to his desk, connected the tablet to the storage system, and copied every relevant video clip into a separate folder. Not a single day missed, not a single second cut. Every frame, every word, every action remained untouched, as evidence of a crime that could not be denied. His fingers moved precisely and firmly, no hesitation. No more foolish hope that Esther would confess or feel remorse. Someone who could chase away an elderly mother with attack dogs again and again without the slightest guilt did not deserve to be protected by silence. When the final video finished saving, Adwale placed the tablet on the desk and stared at the black screen reflecting his own face. There, he no longer saw a confused husband. He saw a son who had awakened far too late, but still in time to do what was right. And then, as the first light of dawn touched the edge of the curtains, Adwale made a decision. A decision that would not only change his marriage, but would force his entire family, his entire lineage, and everyone who believed wealth could hide cruelty, to face the truth. That night, Aidwale's mansion blazed like a jewel in the darkness. From the grand front gate to the main hall, warm golden lights spilled across the marble steps, the perfectly trimmed flower beds, and the long row of luxury cars parked outside like a silent declaration of power, wealth, and status. One by one, the guests stepped out of their cars in expensive clothing, carrying laughter, perfume, and polished greetings. The evening looked so beautiful that no one could have guessed that beneath its glamorous surface, a chilling truth was waiting to be exposed in front of everyone. In the grand dining room, the long table was arranged with exquisite detail-scented candles, crystal glasses, and gleaming silver cutlery. Soft jazz drifted through the air, just enough to heighten the elegance, just enough to cover the brief silences between conversations. Relatives, close business associates, and longtime family friends sat together, raising their glasses, talking about work, children, and recent trips. Small bursts of laughter rose again and again. Everything looked like the perfect upper-class Lagos family dinner, polite, warm, flawless down to the smallest detail. And in the center of it all, Esther moved as though she had been born to belong there. She wore a fitted emerald evening gown, its elegant cut emphasizing her cold, striking beauty. A diamond bracelet sparkled at her wrist whenever she lifted her glass, and on her lips was a soft, graceful smile, just enough to make anyone believe she was the perfect image of a successful businessman's wife. Elegant, socially polished, confident, yet gentle. Esther moved from table to table, bowing her head slightly to elders, smiling at guests, occasionally resting a hand on her husband's shoulder in a gesture of natural intimacy. Not one glance, not one unnecessary movement betrayed that behind her refined appearance was a secret powerful enough to destroy everything she stood on. No one in that room knew that Aidwale had seen it all. No one knew that the man seated at the head of the table in a perfectly tailored black suit with a calm face and a manner so composed it nearly felt detached had entered the evening with a very clear plan. From the beginning of the dinner, he spoke little. He listened more than he responded. He raised his glass when necessary, nodded at the right moments, and let the evening unfold as though everything were normal. But beneath that calm surface was an undertow so violent that with just one moment, this entire mansion would lose the false peace that had been holding it together. From time to time, his eyes rested on Esther. She noticed nothing unusual. Or if she did, she was too confident to believe it could threaten her. She still tilted her head and smiled when one of Aidwale's aunts praised her for organizing such a lovely evening. She still thanked a female guest in a soft voice when the woman said the house had felt warmer ever since Esther became part of it. She still walked proudly through the room, as though this mansion, this name, this family all rested comfortably in the palm of her hand. Aidwale watched her, and for one brief moment, he could hardly connect that woman to the one in the gate camera footage. The woman who had coldly ordered the dogs released to chase his mother away was now standing under the chandelier like a flawless lady of the house. It was that contrast that made him feel sick. Evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it is perfectly made up, wrapped in silk, hidden behind a gentle voice and eyes that know exactly when to perform kindness. The dinner slowly moved toward its end. The beautifully plated dishes were cleared away, wine was poured once more, and the room relaxed as everyone grew full and more comfortable. A few guests leaned back in their chairs, pleased with the warmth of the evening. One of Aidwale's uncles was telling an old story that made several people at the table laugh. In the far corner, a few younger relatives were having a low debate about European football. Everything felt so natural, so ordinary, so peaceful. That was exactly why the next moment became so terrifying. Aidwale set his wine glass down. The crystal made only the softest sound against the table, but somehow it still made his chest tighten. He let his gaze move slowly across the room, as if he wanted to memorize every face before the truth exploded among them. Then he stood. His chair scraped lightly against the stone floor, creating a short sound that was enough to make the conversations around the table gradually stop. Esther looked up at her husband, her social smile still resting on her lips. Perhaps she thought he was about to thank the guests. Perhaps she assumed he was going to make a family toast or say something polished and elegant, the kind of speech expected at a dinner like this. She had no idea that from this second forward, every passing moment was about to become the greatest nightmare of her life. Adewale reached for the small silver spoon beside his glass and lightly tapped it against the rim. Clink. The clear sound rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to slice the air in the room. One tap was enough. Everyone fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. Half-finished smiles froze. Even the server standing near the door stopped walking. The background music seemed to retreat, leaving behind only a stillness that grew heavier by the second. Adewale stood straight at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. The light above cast a pale glow over his face, making his eyes seem darker, deeper, harder to read. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, not angry, and carried none of the recklessness of an emotional outburst. It was that calmness that made people uneasy. "Tonight," he said slowly, clearly, "I want to show everyone something important." A few people in the room looked at one another. A soft laugh came from someone near the end of the table, as though they still thought this was simply a surprise part of the evening. An aunt smiled expectantly. A cousin lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. Only Esther hesitated, very slightly, so slightly that almost no one would have noticed. Her smile remained, but her eyes changed, just a little. A spark of caution flashed in them, like an animal hearing a dry leaf crack beneath a hunter's foot. Adewale turned his head toward the line of household staff standing quietly near the door. "Turn on the screen," he said. A young servant immediately lowered his head and hurried toward the corner of the sitting room connected to the dining area, where a large screen had been installed earlier, but had remained black all evening like an ordinary decorative object. Not many people had noticed it until now. As the servant picked up the remote, several guests shifted in their seats, more curious than concerned. They assumed Adewale was about to show family photos, an anniversary video, or perhaps a surprise tribute to his wife in front of the relatives. Esther turned to her husband with a soft smile. "Adewale," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, "what is this about?" He did not look at her right away. That alone made her throat tighten. Throughout their marriage, no matter how busy or tense he had been, Adewale had always looked at her when she spoke. But now he simply stood there, his eyes fixed on the still dark screen, as though the woman standing less than a meter away was no longer the center of this evening. That indifference was colder than anger. "Everyone should see it," he replied. Just one sentence, nothing more. The atmosphere began to shift. A very light breeze drifted in from the terrace when a server opened the door for a late arriving guest passing by, making the candle flames on the table tremble. The flickering light moved across faces that were growing quieter. An older uncle slowly set down his glass. A woman sitting near Esther tilted her head slightly, sensing that something was wrong, even though she could not yet name it. And Esther, for the first time that night, no longer seemed to know where to place her hands. Her fingers briefly tightened around the edge of her napkin before letting go, trying to keep her face calm. The servant pressed the button. The large screen came to life, casting a cold glow into the center of the elegant room. From every seat, everyone could see it clearly. No image appeared at first, only darkness before the video began. Yet those few seconds of blackness made the air in the room feel almost impossible to breathe. Because by then, everyone understood, even without knowing what the footage contained, that this was not after-dinner entertainment. This was not a surprise thank you speech. This was something else, something prepared deliberately. Something that might change the way they saw one person in that room forever. Adewale slowly let his eyes move across the faces before him. His family, his relatives. The people who had eaten together, laughed together, and praised the beauty of family unity and honor just minutes earlier. He wondered how many of them truly understood that a family does not collapse because of poverty. It collapses when respect disappears. When the weakest person is humiliated at the gate, while the luxurious walls inside remain brightly lit as if nothing happened. Then at last, he turned to Esther. She was looking at him too. There was no smile on her face now. Only a silence as thin as glass stretched between them, and beneath it, the unmistakable feeling that whatever was about to appear on that screen could not be taken back, could not be neatly explained away, could not be buried beneath money or beautiful words. Adewale tilted his head slightly. "Watch carefully," he said. And at that exact moment, the video began to play. The moment the large screen lit up, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. At first what appeared was nothing more than an ordinary security camera view, the mansion's massive black iron gate, the stone-paved space in front of it, the gate lights casting a pale wash over the ground in the night. A few guests still looked more curious than worried. Some tilted their heads slightly. Some took another small sip of wine, waiting to see what Adewale wanted everyone to watch, what he had called important. Then the next image appeared. An elderly woman slowly stepped into frame. She walked very slowly, as if time and the long journey had drained the strength from every step. She wore old village clothes, faded from years of use. On her feet were simple low sandals coated with dust from the road. A thin shawl rested over her shoulders, not enough to protect her from the chill of the late evening. One arm held a worn cloth bag tightly against her chest. Her other hand lightly gripped the iron bars of the gate, as if trying to keep her body from trembling. Under the camera's cold light, her figure looked heartbreakingly small, so lost, so fragile, as though a slightly stronger gust of wind might have knocked her down. Somewhere in the room, someone whispered very softly, "Who is she?" Someone else frowned. One of Adewale's older aunts narrowed her eyes and looked more closely. A few of the younger people still had no idea what was happening. They only found it strange that a poor old woman would appear in a video during such an elegant dinner party. But Adewale said nothing. He stood at the head of the table, silent as stone, his eyes fixed on the screen, and Esther. Her whole body had already gone rigid the moment the old woman stepped into view. Perhaps for one brief second, she still hoped it was a different video. A different angle, something unrelated to her. But that hope died the instant the audio came on clear and merciless. Her voice rang through the room, cold, sharp, without the slightest hesitation. "Open the gate and let the dogs out." Several wine glasses touched down softly against the table. Someone turned sharply to look at Esther. Someone else seemed to think they had heard wrong. But before anyone could react, the gate in the video cracked open, and two large dogs burst out of the yard like black arrows released from a bowstring. They barked viciously, and through the house sound system their barking sounded even more savage than it would have in real life, echoing through the elegant living room like it was tearing through the polished layer of civility covering the evening. They lunged toward the old woman with encouraged aggression, with the instinct of animals that had clearly been given permission. On the screen, the old woman stumbled backward in fear. The cloth bag fell from her hands. A few items from the village rolled onto the ground: small oranges, a bag of peanuts, a carefully wrapped piece of fabric, perhaps the simple gifts she had brought for her successful son. She lifted her hands in front of her chest in pure reflex, trying to protect herself. Her whole body shook. Her steps were unsteady, as though she might fall at any moment. In the room, whispers began to rise, then died in people's throats. A woman sitting near the screen raised a hand to cover her mouth. One of Adewale's uncles pushed halfway up from his seat and then dropped back down, as if his legs had suddenly lost all strength. Then a hoarse voice no one could tell whose broke through the thick air. "Wait, isn't that his mother?" The words landed like a hammer blow. The entire room fell deathly silent. There was no music anymore, no clinking glasses, no scraping chairs. Only the light from the large screen cast across stunned faces, and the sound of breathing growing heavier as people began to understand what they were witnessing. That was not a beggar, not a stranger, not an intruder. That was Adewale's mother. The woman who had given birth to him. The woman who had raised him in a poor village so that one day he could become the most powerful man in this room. And the woman being chased away from the mansion gate by dogs was the mother of the host himself. Every eye in the room turned immediately to Esther. This time, they were no longer polite social glances. They were looks of horror, disbelief, judgment, people trying to reconcile the elegant woman in the emerald dress with the voice they had just heard in the video. The graceful hostess who had moved among them all evening. The perfect wife everyone had praised. The daughter-in-law many had once thought was a source of pride for the family. And now, that same woman, on that screen, had ordered dogs to chase away her husband's mother. Esther went pale. Her lipstick was still a deep red, but beneath her makeup, her face turned white as though all the blood had been drained from it. The hand resting on the back of her chair began to tremble. Her breathing turned short and shallow. She looked at the screen, then at Adewale, then at the faces around her as they all recoiled from her with their eyes. She knew everything was over. But the last instinct of someone cornered is always denial. Always the desperate attempt to grab a few more seconds of control before the abyss swallows everything whole. Esther shot to her feet. The chair behind her scraped violently across the stone floor, producing a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. Every eye was on her now. She opened her mouth, her lips trembling. When she spoke, her voice was no longer soft, no longer confident. It came out broken, unsteady, almost unrecognizable. Adewale. I can explain. But Adewale only turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was so cold that several people sitting nearby instinctively held their breath. It was no longer the look of an angry husband, nor the look of a man who had just discovered betrayal. It was the look of a son who had just watched his mother's humiliation displayed before the entire family. A look with no softness left in it, no trust left to hold on to, no mercy left to offer. Explain what? He asked. His voice was low, deep, calm in a way that was terrifying. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. But each word came out like cold steel. Explain why you sent dogs to chase away the woman who gave me life. No one said a word. The question hung in the room like a blade. Esther opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. She blinked rapidly, perhaps trying to force back tears, or perhaps trying to force her mind to invent a defense quickly enough, cleverly enough, convincingly enough to save the last scraps of her dignity. But how do you explain the unforgivable? How do you deny what everyone just heard when your own voice is still ringing from the speakers, cold and clear? How do you defend treating your husband as mother like a disgrace to be driven away from the gate? Adewale, she tried again, but he cut her off, never taking his eyes off her. No, just one word, not loud, but so final that the whole room felt as though something had just snapped beyond repair. Adewale took one slow step toward the screen. The frozen frame from the video, his mother recoiling from the two dogs, cast a pale light across his shoulders. He looked directly at Esther, then turned to the rest of his family. You've all seen it, he said, his voice rougher, now heavier. This is not a rumor, not a misunderstanding, not one person's word against another's. This is the truth. One of his aunts lifted a hand to wipe away tears. One of his uncles lowered his face toward the table. A younger female cousin stared at Esther as if she were looking at a frightening stranger. Shame spread through the room, not only because of Esther's cruelty, but because all of them were realizing something even more painful. This may have happened many times, and no one knew. An old mother had been humiliated outside the grand mansion of her own son, while inside, everyone had continued living, eating, laughing, completely unaware. Adewale turned back to the screen once more. There she still was, his mother, standing in that timid posture, one hand raised as if to shield herself the village gifts fallen. At her feet, confusion and hurt all over the face of a woman who could not understand why she was being treated this way. The image pierced his chest again, but this time the pain did not make him shake. It made him harden. That woman, he said slowly. Went hungry so I could go to school. She stood under the burning sun and walked through the rain so I would not lose my future. She spent her whole life in poverty so I could stand here today. He paused, his eyes darkening. And you, he looked at Esther. You dared to turn her into something you were ashamed of? Esther shook her head over and over, tears spilling down now, but they moved no one. No, it's not what you think. Then what is it? Adewale asked. The air froze. No one came to save her. No one stepped in. No one spoke in her defense. Because in moments like this, truth has a weight of its own. It crushes every performance, every clever excuse, every layer of polished courtesy people wear to move through society. Esther stood there, breathing hard, gripping the back of the chair like someone about to collapse. But what was truly collapsing was not her body. It was her place in this family. It was the image of the perfect lady of the house she had built through luxury, appearance, and well-timed smiles. In only a few minutes, that video had shattered it all. Adewale did not need to yell. He did not need to make a scene. His silence was more frightening than any outburst could have been. He simply stood there, in the middle of the elegant living room, surrounded by relatives and friends, beneath warm golden lights and sparkling crystal glasses, like a living sentence already passed. And in that brutal silence, everyone began to understand that what they were witnessing was not merely a family argument. This was the day truth rose through glamour. The day filial devotion confronted cruelty. The day a poor mother from the village, in worn clothes and dust-covered sandals, became more dignified than anyone dressed in silk in that room. And it was also the day Esther understood that some actions, once dragged into the light, leave no road back. The entire room remained trapped in that thick, crushing silence that only appears when a truth too heavy has just fallen among people who were never prepared to catch it. The large screen at the front of the room was still glowing, frozen on the image of the elderly mother stepping back from the two vicious dogs, her cloth bag fallen at her feet, a few small village gifts scattered across the cold stone ground. The pale blue light from the screen washed over the stunned faces around the room, making everything inside that luxurious mansion suddenly feel cold, exposed, stripped of every last trace of the artificial warmth of a family celebration. Esther was still standing there, one hand gripping the back of her chair as if letting go would make her collapse. Her flawless makeup, her expensive evening gown, her sparkling jewelry under the lights, all of it suddenly looked painfully meaningless. She no longer resembled the elegant lady of the evening. She was only a woman who had just been stripped bare by the truth in front of everyone who had once admired her. But Adewale did not look at her again. There are moments when anger passes and leaves behind something far more frightening, finality. He turned away, slowly, without haste, without drama. Yet it was exactly that calmness that made everyone in the room seem to stop breathing as they followed the sound of his footsteps across the marble floor. In the corner of the living room, where the light was softer and farther from the center of everyone's gaze, his mother was sitting quietly in a low armchair. No one knew when she had been brought inside. Perhaps when the party began. Perhaps just before the video was played. Perhaps Adewale had planned that from the start, not to cause his mother more pain, but to make sure she would not once again be turned into a story told by someone else. She had the right to be there, the right to see the truth called by its real name, the right to have her dignity restored in front of the very people who had once remained silent. She sat upright, both thin hands resting on her knees. The clothes she wore were still the simple garments of a village woman, not elegant, not glamorous, but clean and carefully smoothed, as if she had tried to offer her son the best appearance she could manage for their meeting. Her silver hair was neatly tied back at the nape of her neck. Her time-clouded eyes were lowered to the floor, blaming no one, seeking no pity. Her entire presence carried the familiar stillness of someone who had survived too much hardship to even remember how to complain. Adewale stopped in front of her. For a moment, the most powerful man in the room was no longer a billionaire, No longer the owner of the mansion, no longer the man people spoke to with admiration and respect. He was only a son standing before the mother who had sacrificed her entire life so he could stand tall today. He bent down very slowly, as if afraid of startling her. Then he took her hand. It was a small hand, thin and rough, with veins clearly visible beneath wrinkled skin, the hand of years. The hand of fields, markets, skipped meals given up for a child, sleepless nights full of worry, seasons of rain and sun that had worn away youth and strength alike. The moment he touched it, Adwale's heart tightened, because suddenly he realized how long it had been since he had truly held his mother's hand like this. Too long since he had done nothing more than send money, send gifts, send brief greetings over the phone, forgetting that there are things a mother does not need from her son in the form of money. Sometimes all she needs is to be welcomed into his home as family. His mother lifted her eyes to him. Her gaze was so gentle it hurt. There was no blame in it. No question of why he had allowed this to happen. Only a deep exhaustion and an old love that had never gone out. That was what made Adwale's throat tighten. He gently closed his hand around hers a little more, as if trying to give her the warmth he should have given her long ago. When he spoke, his voice dropped lower, not loud, but steady as stone. This woman you chased away is the reason I am standing here today. He did not speak quickly. Each word came out like something carved into stone, something everyone in the room would have to hear, understand, and remember. This woman, he repeated, his eyes still on his mother, is the one who went hungry so I could eat. She is the one who stayed awake when I was sick, who worked when she should have rested, who carried shame, pain, and poverty on her back so I could one day stand with dignity. No one in the room moved. Several people lowered their heads. One aunt dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. A younger cousin covered her mouth to stop a sob. Even some of the older men, who usually carried themselves with rigid strength, turned away so no one would see that their eyes had reddened. Because there are truths that, once spoken in a son's voice before his mother, strike the softest place inside the human heart. Not because they are beautiful, but because they are true. Adwale slowly straightened up, but he did not let go of his mother's hand. Then he turned around. His eyes found Esther. She was still standing in the middle of the room, but now the distance between them could no longer be measured in a few yards of marble floor. It was measured by the collapse of trust, by the humiliation of a mother, by the cost of arrogance. Esther's face was wet with tears, but in that moment no one mistook tears for innocence. Some tears appear only when people are exposed, not when they realize they were wrong. Adwale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, each word clear and deliberate, "From today on, this house will only have room for those who know how to respect my mother." No one exhaled loudly. No one interrupted. No one needed him to explain what that sentence meant, because everyone understood. They understood that this was not a passing remark spoken in anger, not a harsh sentence thrown out in a moment of pain. This was a line being drawn in public, a boundary that could not be erased, a line between gratitude and cruelty, between family and pretense, between someone who honors his roots and someone who sees humble origins as a shameful thing to be chased away with dogs. Esther opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped herself. Because perhaps for the first time in her life, she understood that not everything can be saved by words. Not every crack can be covered by a perfect appearance. And not every door, once shut by contempt and cruelty, can be opened again with tears. One of Adwale's uncles slowly stood up. He walked over to Adwale's mother and bowed his head low, like a late apology on behalf of the entire family. Then one of the aunts stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. After that, others followed, quietly, without spectacle, without grand speeches, just small, sincere gestures, as if they were all trying to salvage something from the ashes of that evening. No one could erase what had happened, but at least in that moment, they wanted the old woman to know that she was not invisible, not lesser, not something to be ashamed of. She was the root of the man who had brought honor to this entire family. Adwale's mother seemed overwhelmed by so much attention. She gave a small shake of her head, pressing her lips together as if to say she did not need anyone's pity. But then her trembling hand tightened around her son's, and at last her old eyes filled with tears. Not from humiliation this time, as they head outside the gate, but because now, finally, her son truly saw her, called her by her rightful place, allowed her to remain in the light instead of being pushed out of it. Adwale leaned down a little closer to her. "I'm sorry," he said very softly, only loud enough for the nearest people to hear. "I came home too late." She looked at him, tears falling, but her smile was gentle. "You came home," she replied, her voice weak but clear. "That is enough." That sentence alone made many hearts in the room tighten. Because that is the way of mothers. They may endure the whole world, but if their child returns, they are still willing to forgive the rest of life. That night, the luxurious party did not end with laughter, nor with a graceful speech, nor with the soft music that had opened the evening. It ended in the reflective silence of people who had just witnessed a truth so simple, yet so often forgotten when life becomes comfortable. No one is truly noble if they know how to despise the person who sacrificed everything for them to stand where they are. The candles still burned on the dining table, but no one cared any more about the expensive dishes or the fine wine. The chandelier still blazed overhead, but what no one would ever forget was not the grandeur of the mansion. It was the thin hand of an old mother in her son's hand. An image simpler than everything luxurious around it, but stronger than every symbol of power. And Adwale, standing beside his mother in that room, understood one thing with perfect clarity. The greatest success a person can have is not how large a mansion he builds, how much money he earns, or how many people bow their heads in admiration before him. The greatest success is when the one who gave him life can walk into his home without fear, without shame, without standing outside the gate like a stranger. That night, everything changed forever. Not only Adwale's marriage, not only Esther's place in that house, but the way the entire family looked at itself, and at the values they had once believed mattered most. And years later, perhaps no one would remember exactly what was served at that dinner, what the guests had worn, or what song had been playing at the start of the night. But they would remember something else with perfect clarity, as if it had been engraved into memory. A son holding his mother's hand in front of the whole family, and using the truth itself to return to her the dignity no one had any right to steal. That was the lesson of that night. That money may build very high walls, but only gratitude can hold a home together. That status may make people look up at you, but only the way you treat your parents reveals who you truly are. And that in life, the person who forgets where they come from will, sooner or later, lose everything they once believed they held so tightly in their hands.